Imagine this, you are on a team with a couple of people working on super important projects, but at the end of the day, the team gets all the credit and your contribution is completely undervalued or not even recognized. I recently worked with a young professional who was on a team with a couple of other people. One of them seemed to be a quiet quitter, another one was a junior engineer, so he needed to actually train her and help her. And a fourth person seemed to be always missing in action. They promised they would do their tickets, and when the deadline approached, they were nowhere to be seen, and he ended up doing all the work. If this has happened to you and you're wondering whether you should do something about it, then this video is for you. This is unfortunately a very common issue that a lot of young engineers are facing. They're lumped into these sprint teams, and the only updates a manager gets is usually a team update. What happens in these cases is not everybody contributes equally. And if you're one of the people that always leans out of the window, does extra work, is taking on additional tasks, and thinks ahead to prevent problems, but you're not getting the credit, and then you are absolutely classified as a B player because nobody knows what you're doing. The issue is a visibility gap to your performance, and you need to change that if you don't want to be classified as a B player or be an unknown or being pulled down to team average. You might be wondering what you can do, if there's anything you could do other than work harder. And my solution and suggestion is not working harder, but to communicate differently about your contributions and your impact to the team. In this video, I'll show you a framework and the exact steps of why this framework works, no matter the industry, no matter what your level is. And I'll give you an implementation plan for 4 weeks so you can test it out in your own job. My name is Sanja. I'm a former HR and talent development leader, and I've coached many young professionals who feel stuck in their career or in their jobs and help them get unstuck. In this video, we're going to cover the framework of how to regain your visibility and move yourself from a B player status to an A player status, and also go over an implementation strategy that's really easy to follow. To begin with, I want to make it clear that most managers don't ignore you because they are bad managers or bad leaders. If you think about the span of control these days, most managers deal with at least 5 to 10 direct reports. That's a lot of people to keep track of. If you're thinking about how often you even see your manager, it's maybe during team meetings and maybe every 1 or 2 weeks in a one-on-one meeting. That's just not enough for you to stand out to that manager. And as long as there's no problem, you're classified as a B player. If you think about the team of 10, your manager usually, for the sake of ease, will categorize the team as follows. About 10 to 15% of his people are his go-to people. These are people that he relies on for solving tough problems. They get first access to difficult projects or high visibility projects. Then there is about 50 to 60% of B players. These are your steady eddies. They're doing their work, they're showing up, but they're not doing anything above and beyond. And usually nothing exciting happens in that group other than to maintain the day-to-day business. And then there are 10 to 20% of people that he has no idea what they're doing. He either doesn't like them, or they're new, or he's not interested. There are personality frictions, and those are people who land on the layoff list first. But even if you're B player, you are slated for layoff list if there have to be made cuts, and he can't debate who contributes what, who is more valuable. He will always make sure his A players are protected. So the goal for you is, with this framework, to move from a B player of no visibility, even though you're contributing more than the others, to the A player status and get the credit that you deserve by building trust with that manager and communicating with him regularly. Now, there is a formula of how to do this well and how to succeed without adding more work to your plate or the manager's plate. So let me introduce you to the framework. It is called a performance spotlight framework. It has 3 pillars, and you need all 3 for this thing to work. The first one is strategic documentation. You need to have a record and a bank of accomplishments and outputs that you generate weekly. You have a document where you're collecting your achievements. The second pillar is the value translation. Most young professionals don't know how to do this well and struggle with it. This means you're connecting the dot from your output, not your tasks, your output, to what the department goals are, the manager goals, the functional goals, or the business goals are. Different leaders will read different results differently. You need to have a value translation mechanism, translating your output and your accomplishments into what is valued by the leadership of your organization. The third one is the spotlight communication. How can you update your manager on a regular basis, either during one-on-ones or other methods that stand out from the crowd? If you're just relying on team reports, you will be in that mediocre B player category. You need to have your own personal documentation where you're moving yourself into that A player circle around that manager, the go-to person he relies on and trusts. This framework works because it is based on some psychological behaviors that we are not aware of or that we cannot turn off. One of them is called the peak end rule. People can't remember what happens on a day-to-day basis. There's too much going on. And so what we focus on and what your memory is trained on remembering, including your managers, are the highlights, the lowlights, and what happened most recently. You know this probably from performance reviews. Most managers will review the last 3 months and completely forget what happens the other 9 months of the year. Recency bias and that peak and end memory is what you need to fight against, and this is what that framework will help with. The second is called a Restorff effect, which basically talks about the findings that if messaging is always even, it does not get registered unless it stands out. Makes it simple. If something is different from the others, this is what gets remembered, and this is most likely what gets acted upon. So if everybody is supplying a team update and you're providing an individual output update and you shape it a certain way that is easy for that manager to comprehend and digest, then you win, you stand out. Third is what we all know as a cognitive bandwidth limit. We can only absorb so much information. Your manager gets bombarded with problems and facts. There is no way you in between two doors or before a meeting or after meeting mentioning something about your contribution that this will be remembered. The framework helps fighting that cognitive bandwidth limit that your manager has. Not his fault. So let's go over in more detail about the 3 pillars of this framework so you can implement each of them and understand why you need all 3 of them in order to have an effect on your manager's perception of what kind of team player you are. The first pillar is strategic documentation. We talked about that you need an output bank of all the accomplishments you're doing, not just once a year or twice a year when it's performance review time, but weekly. Every week you're working on something. It's not just tasks. Don't document your task. Document the output. Start a Notion document, an Excel sheet, whatever you prefer and what's the easiest. This does not take a long time. It takes 5 minutes every Friday. Make it a time-blocked activity so you remember it and it becomes a habit. The document has to have 4 elements. What did you do? What was the problem that you solved and the impact it had? And what was proof of that impact? Any kind of feedback. That's what you're looking for. The second pillar of this framework is value translation, and this is something that most young professionals struggle with because they're not yet trained to link the dots from their work to what the manager cares about, to what the business unit cares about, to what the organization cares about. So the value translation needs to look at your output and put different filters on it depending on the level of leadership who might see this. This isn't about exaggerating or blowing up your accomplishments or making it sound grander than it was. And you're also not throwing your team under the bus saying you did it all by yourself. You're very honest what your contribution was, but if you're consistently teaching other team members, helping other team members, taking over for other team members, then that's an output and impact you want to document. That's what needs to be on there. I took an additional work and we were able to close the ticket by the deadline promised. yada, yada, yada. I created a small playbook that you can download, and I'll tell you at the end of this video some more about it, but it has templates and examples that would apply across industries and different levels of your position. So you can always apply it because it's relying on a concept of these 3 pillars, and you can always apply it. The goal, as I said, is to move you from invisibility and not being recognized as part of a team approach to being seen as an A player who goes above and beyond. The last pillar is the spotlight communication. This is the actual way of how you let your manager know what your accomplishments were for this week or in a bi-weekly rhythm. You need to decide what cadence is most appropriate and works for your manager the best. I've worked with managers who don't read emails. What do you do in that case? You use Slack or some other functions. So deciding to do these regular updates is really important. If you're doing it quarterly or semi-annually or irregularly, then this will be garbage. You cannot use it. Your manager will be more irritated than pleasantly surprised. You need to give him something that he can use, and it's a snapshot of what you're doing. So you're taking from your bank and you're making a snapshot. If your manager likes dashboard, make a dashboard. If your manager likes 3 main things, then do 3 bullets. And you test it out and you tweak the system over time, and most likely it won't work for every manager, so you have to readjust with every new leader that you're getting. I hear a lot from engineers that they're not comfortable with bragging about themselves. There is this ingrained idea that your work should speak for itself. It doesn't. You need to speak for your work. This framework will help you do that. So this is how you would implement this. You can start on Monday. Start with a 4-week runway. Get into the habit first of even documenting your own work. Most of the things you're not even paying attention to of what you're really doing or where you're helping out or where you're resolving a crisis, because it takes half a day and then the crisis passes and you move on to something else. So it's really important for the week 1 of this new practice on Friday to schedule some time. In the beginning, schedule more time, make it an hour, and look back at the week and think of all the crisis moments that happened during that week. Look at your calendar. Where did you spend more time? Where did you take over for somebody? Where did you go above and beyond of your job? And put in those 4 elements that we discussed earlier. The second week, you're moving into practicing verbally translating your value to that manager. So this is where you're trying to test out what will he or she react to most favorably. What do they want to hear? How do they remember information best? Does it take to walk by their office and you casually say, hey, by the way, I did X, Y, and Z? That's one of your examples from your story bank that you can tell him, and you translate it into the dot that's important to him. What does he care about based on the team achievement, business objectives, organizational goals? So you're practicing basically, not just reciting, hey, I closed ticket X, Y, and Z. We moved this one forward. We completed this sprint. That's a task. What was the output? What was the problem you solved, and who benefited from it? And what proof do you have it benefited the company or the customer? Say that. Now by week 3, you can formalize that and send an actual document. Now that can be either a little Slack message, it can be an email, it can be some kind of other dashboard status update, either with your one-on-one or some other way to deliver that to your manager. You can start small and expand on that. You need to get his reaction of how he can absorb the information. It needs to work for him and how he can remember what you did. Don't worry about bragging or being different. That's what you want. We're moving from B player to A player. And by week 5, you're on your way, right? This will be then a habit of where you're regularly updating your manager. I recently coached somebody who tried this out, and after week 3, he noticed or was told that his manager actually took one of his status updates and presented that at a higher leadership meeting because he wanted to have his own team look good. So they look for facts and things that they can brag about to others, their peers or their higher ups, of how great the team is. So that was one signal to my coachee that this is working, that the framework really had value and not just busy work or adding more things to read to that manager's life. A few weeks later, he was tapped for a high visibility project, and he also noticed how the manager would seek him out more and more with questions to get his advice. These are the kind of signals you're looking for. Is your manager starting to approach you with questions, with more projects, or simply engaging you in more conversation? That's exactly the positive feedback loop you're looking for that confirms that your framework approach is working. And over time, you are closing that visibility gap that you were suffering before from doing all the work, yet getting no recognition and no credit, to now being an A player, still doing the same work, still working hard, but not more than before. But now you have the visibility, the credit, and most likely the trust from your manager. So here's your challenge. In the next 30 days, think about how you could implement this system. You can go by a week-to-week implementation or something faster depending on your relationship with your manager. But please try it out and see how it changes the perception that your manager and maybe other leaders have, and how it's shifting from where you are currently and down the line in 3 or 4 months. Let me know in the comments if this was valuable for you and if you tried it out, and any other suggestions you have for future videos. I'll see you in the next video.